This is the September 22nd, 2021 Brookline School Committee Finance Subcommittee meeting. We're going to start with the first item on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes for, now I lost it, June 11th, June 10th, 2021. Can I get a motion? Thanks, Susan. And a second, Stephen? Okay, voting. Oh, look, and David's joining us. Hi, David. Actually, any comments before we go to a vote? Anything that we should adjust on the minutes? Okay, Susan, how do you vote?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
David, this is on the minutes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I vote yes, so that's done. And then the second item on the agenda is approval of grants and gifts. Did everybody see there was a revised gift memo earlier today?
I'm sorry, I've not been on email. I can go look right now though.
Yes,
Okay, I think it was just,
around.
am I remembering right? It was just the one addition at the end, the palette of paper.
Exactly.
Okay, so one addition, Susan. Can I get a motion for approval and then we can have any discussion? Stephen, second.
Motion to approve.
Thank you, David. I only had one question on this. And anyone else, of course, have questions, but my question was, Sam, I was wondering, for grants, I happened to notice on the Metco grant that we only charge a 2% indirect cost rate on it.
Correct.
And I was wondering, is that because Metco limits indirect costs? Like, does the district have an established indirect cost rate that we apply to?
I think
Grants?
it's more DESI limits indirect costs, so they determine based on, I think, our end of year report. I mean, I will tell you, this is the first district that I've had indirect costs allocated because other districts have decided to apply 100% of the funds to direct expenses. But I thought it was unusually low percentage as well, but I don't think it's anything we control. If, you know, that's driven by information we provide to the state and they determine what our indirect cost rate is. So it's not a Metco thing. I believe it's a DESI thing.
Okay. I mean, I hear what you're saying about direct expenses, but to my thinking about it, we should be allocating the full cost of any program so that we understand it as opposed to having hidden costs associated with them. So to whatever extent we're able to, as we're thinking about, for example, grant funded programs, and for example, the ones that happen through the Innovation Fund or other programs where we're bringing a program on board later on or considering it like a pilot program, which isn't the case necessarily of the Metco program, but how we're sort of appropriately allocating for the full cost of these things when we talk about it. That would
Right.
just be something to think about.
Sure.
Are there any other comments or questions on grants and gifts? No. Okay. Stephen.
Yeah.
You're voting yes?
Sorry, this is the vote. Yes, I am.
Yes. David.
Yes.
Susan.
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay. Let's
Sorry,
go ahead.
Mariah,
Yeah.
real fast. Where are the indirect rates? Are they on the grant acceptance memo?
They weren't on the memo. They were on the last page of the Metco
Probably
backup
budget.
documentation.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Thank you.
And it was like a 2.1% rate or something like that. 2 point something
Took
percent.
before some, yeah, I think.
I just, sorry. And the detail budget is located where?
If you look at the grant acceptance memo, it's 25 pages long. And so there's the cover
Yeah.
page, and then there's like a whole bunch of backup for each one of those. And the Metco one starts on page like 19 or 18, something like that.
Oh, got it. Okay,
17,
thanks, Mariah.
yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next item on the agenda, which is fiscal year 22 budget update, and specifically talking about ESSER. And I'm hoping we're going to spend like 15 to 20 minutes max on this so that we can spend the bulk of the remaining time on fiscal year 23.
I mean, if you want me to jump in, I prepared a Google Doc, which I shared with Mariah and Linus to basically go over a little bit of a primer. We're talking ESSER 2 and 3, not so much ESSER 1 for a host of reasons. ESSER 1 was substantially lesser in amount and basically has been spent out. And so there's really nothing left to talk about. ESSER 2 and 3, and I'll take them individually because 2 came before 3.
Sam, can I interrupt you real quick? Does it make sense to show your memo or do you want to just?
Yeah,
talk
it's
to
not
it?
as, yeah, let's show it.
Okay,
You
I don't
can
have it.
share
Do you
the-
mind sharing it or do you want me to share it? I have to download it.
I can try to share it.
Okay.
Hold on. Let me see how bear with me. Let's see how I can do that. So here it is, but then how do I share? Why don't I can just share it to everybody individually. Maybe that makes more sense. There's not many.
We have attendees in the, oh, Linus is sharing. Okay.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Linus.
Okay. So that's the memo, and just to walk through it, thank you. I mean, ESSER, just for those, and I need to remind myself what these acronyms stand for. ESSER stands for Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief, and then Fund. In this case, there was an ESSER 1 that's in the rearview mirror. ESSER 2. And then ESSER 3 is tied to the American Rescue Plan, but it's still an ESSER grant. But that was part of ESSER. That was part of ARP. ESSER 2, the important things here are 2 things. One, the amount of money was $1,641,807, and the amount of time you have to spend it. And so the money was awarded in FY21, which meant from basically fiscal year from July 1st of 20 up through September 30th of 23, which is beginning of fiscal 24. Just a spoiler alert, the money won't be anywhere near close to F24. But if it were, you could wait that long to spend it. Of that $1,641,807, I'll tell you what was reported in the application, but and I'll tell you, and what I'm showing you is what actually, if we did an amendment tomorrow, what the amendment would show and what the difference is. So the first line is $777,170 for 8 people that were either school adjustment counselors or social workers, and that includes the MTRS assessment that DESE requires you. That's a 9% charge for anybody who's licensed that you have to pay on top of what you pay them. Then the next 2 lines total $565,000 even. That was initially allocated to rent tents. Tents were rented in the spring for some amount of money, not $565,000. And luckily, there was money in the operating budget when the year end closed that the grant was not charged for these tents. The operating budget was. And we're not renting, we're not using any tents. Even if it's just not a good use of money, in my view anyway, Matt's view. And so that $565,000, $280,858 is being allocated to K-12 curriculum that when the budget was drawn, it was reduced by that amount of money from what was in F21 to fund basic need of materials for curriculum coordination. And so this amount of money restores it just back to what it was in F21. The remaining $284,142, which is the difference between that and 565, is basically money that is available and has not been committed yet. I call it reserved for future system-wide needs to be determined. Next is 193,422 for the Universal Summer Program. That happened. That's what was budgeted, just as it was put in. If it went over, then that would draw off the 284. And then 106,215 closes this out for Alexia assessment tool. That is how that money has been planned to be utilized. I don't know if you want me to stop there and talk about it or go to ESSER 3.
Sam, can I ask a question?
Sure.
On these allocations, when was, forgive me again for the ignorance, when were the policy recommendations made to spend ESSER 2 in this way?
I wasn't here, couldn't tell you.
Well,
Just someone in
remember, Stephen, I'm gonna chime in on this a little bit. We essentially spent almost in the budget from last spring, we used the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 entire calculations to balance the operating budget. And so what we're seeing here is how it was allocated and the fact that there's a gap, but essentially like this is funding base. You know, it could have been, you could have seen computer equipment, you could have seen any one of the categories spent here. And that would have been sort of what we had decided to do.
So is it all fungible? Is there any meaning to these particular line items then?
One line item I would say which was important, and this defers to Susan, is the USP presumably is one-time expenditure. I don't anticipate, unless I hear otherwise, that being repeated. So therefore, that is one-time money that would not have to be funded somewhere else next year. Everything else is ongoing operating expense, as I understand it, except for the 284 that hasn't been filled yet.
Sorry.
And I think it's an open, just to say though, I'm not sure Universal Summer Program is definitely one time, but it's at least, it was new in a pilot, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
Sorry, so is this fungible? Does it really matter what's in here?
I think it's, I'll say it, this ESSER is very flexible. I think there's a great amount of latitude for the kind of expenses you can put here. I don't think we could buy a Bentley for Linus and charge it here, but I think you can, you have a great bit of latitude, districts do, and how you utilize these funds.
Presumably you all understand this a lot better than me. I just am not sure what the purpose of the memo is, if it doesn't really matter whether it's ESSER covering it or another account.
I think the purpose of the memo is twofold. It lets you know as a subcommittee how much money potentially we have to soften to flatten the cliff that we're going to go over. The other important thing is with this community engagement, it also gives you a preview of what we would be maybe telling the community for them to provide input on how these monies would be utilized. So you're getting a preview.
I think we need to get to the end of the memo, but so that you can get the context of why this is important, because we haven't hit the second half of it yet.
So then ESSER 3 is more than twice as big as ESSER 2. It's 3,667,388. You have a whole nother year to spend it. You have from 7/1 of 21, because it's an F22 grant, till 9/30 of 24 into fiscal 25. Again, I'm hoping to stretch this money at least into F23, not anywhere into 24 or 25. Of that money right now, we haven't even sent the application in, but it's due October 4th into DESI. Although we probably will amend it because we wouldn't have had the public input yet, and we can't amend it, but we got to put something in. Right now, what I inherited as a plan to spend was $3,057,815 for the entire literacy specialist district-wide, 29.3 FTE. And again, that includes a 9% assessment for MTRS. 453,588 that has not been committed yet that I can see. And so I call that the same reserve for future system-wide needs to be determined, or to ideally, my recommendation would be to push this out into F23 and not spend it right now. 110,000 even for workshop costs not funded due to, used to be in the base budget. Now the expectation is ESSER is going to pay for that. It's 10 grand to school, the 8K to 8, BEEP, and 20 grand for the high schools, the 110. 29 grand for mentoring 45 new staff, and 14,500 for repair, maintenance, upgrade of computer software. That spends out the $3 2/3 million. That's where we're at. I'm happy to have you talk about it, but that's the latest information until community input, until other people weigh in on how this money might be spent differently. But that's what I have right now as the best information.
Thank you, Sam. Questions from the committee? Or I see Cliff. Go ahead, Cliff.
So I'm sure not remembering things very well. It's been a number of months since I've actually looked at some of this stuff. But Mariah, as you said, all of this stuff was sort of undertaken last spring to close anticipated gaps. And to the extent that those gaps didn't actually come to pass, I guess I have two questions. Obviously, if that money isn't needed because we have as much of a shortfall, then clearly you can, do other things with it. But I'm also curious, remind me whether or not the town allocated extra funds from funds that it got from the federal government to help, I think, supplement the ESSER funds to close the anticipated gap. Is that a mistake?
I don't believe that happened. We got our
Okay.
one number and we stuck to that number all the way through the process. So there was the adjustment from the insurance, the GIC insurance adjustment, but other than that, we didn't get another adjustment up from the town.
Okay.
If you're asking, should the town claw back money? More or less, that's what you're asking.
More or less. That's what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
But in a nice way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, Susan?
No, so I appreciate this, Sam. And so when we talk about the money being awarded in SR3 being awarded in FY22, I think it's important for both of these, just to be clear, when we say PSB has allocated the funds in the following manner for both of those, I think it's important to put a fiscal year on that.
Yeah.
That we've allocated the funds in the following manner for what fiscal year? For the 1.6 and the 3.7.
Almost to have two columns in that chart where the line that is the reserve for future years is in a different column, sort of a thing.
Right, so that you kind of at least have a sense of like when the cliff, when the cliff starts. That makes sense.
Can I ask, this is related to that a little bit, but is there a reason that we're not, I can think of several reasons to do this, spending as basically completing the spending on ESSER2 in the current fiscal year, essentially moving some of those smaller programs to ESSER2 from ESSER3 to allow for essentially all of the balance of unallocated funds to live in ESSER3?
Are you asking me, Mariah?
I am, sorry, Sam. Yes, I'm asking you why we wouldn't just put it all into one.
That would be my
fund.
recommendation, would be I'd spend ESSER2 out this year and then carry ESSER3, whatever we can, into next year.
I think that would be great. I mean, A, from simplification, but also the community outreach portion of SR3. I think it's important to show that there are funds that are that haven't already been allocated, and that there is an opportunity, a potential for community input to inform how those funds get spent. So I think it would be beneficial to not only streamline your process, but also have that be clear to people. Sort of have a $1 amount that we can point to under SR3.
Yeah, I think this also, just to tie it to yesterday's discussion at the curriculum subcommittee, which Stephen was at, but I think, and Suzanne, you know, I think if people in the community see a number like $3 million for literacy specialists relative to all the other priorities that we have in the district, I think, you know, understanding where community voice does and doesn't impact the budgeting process, I think will be important. We had a long discussion yesterday about not only do we not want to be actually overweighting math and English relative to science and social studies and other things, but we don't want to signal that we are either. Like it's an optics thing because it's an impression out there, but it's also on the merits. We don't want to be doing that. And so I think some of these might just confuse some of that messaging, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think making it clear that the decision was to fund the base program, and these are just sort of, to Stephen's earlier point, I'm going to sort of overstate this right now, but random, they're not totally random, but just chunks of the budget that have been allocated, but that it's not like there's no necessarily a connection between which parts of the base program have been pulled over to fund, to make that even more clear.
Right, because because just to come back to David's point, I think, or sorry, Stephen's point, I think if you look at this, it looks like we have added all these things in as a result of having ESSER money. And so the natural question is going to be, why did you add $3 million of literacy specialists when you got this ESSER money, as opposed to all the other things that people might want to do with the money? So just I think it's confusing.
I mean, do we need to communicate out anything other than the remainder?
There's a community engagement mandate within the federal legislation. So we do need to communicate out what we're planning on doing with the money, but also solicit feedback from the community and feedback and input from the community.
On how
so
to
yes,
spend it, or on how we already have allocated it?
My recollection is that, Donna, correct me, or Sam, correct me, but I remember the language being vague and unclear. Like sort of yes, that's how I remember. Do you remember, Sam or Donna, how that wording is in the community engagement bit?
Looking at I'm looking to see what's in the guidelines from DESE and fund use. I'm not seeing anything here in Ed Grants about my sense. You know, I don't want to speculate. I can only, my sense is sooner to engage is better than later, because then you have more chance to pivot. It depends on, depending on the community. It's, you know, some communities, the one I left was in a position that they weren't planning on spending $1 of ESSER 3 until F23. We're not in that position, so I don't know how many are similarly situated. We're already starting to spend some of that money, as you know, when the year started. But I will get back to you.
I just found the slides that I think came from, it is from DESE, that Donna had forwarded at one point, and it says stakeholder outreach and input is required on the implementation plan, and that implementation plan has to do with return to school.
So
it's not clear.
Late to the party, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was a multi-year funding thing, and the application wasn't due until October. So
October 4th. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, it was not clear, Stephen. Any other comments or questions on this? Go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, so I just want to thank you, Sam. I don't know that we had it broken down line by line, dollar by dollar from last spring. So actually this is helpful. So I appreciate it. I mean, I'm not sure why Alexia assessment tool is part of ESSER, but be that as it may, it's nice to know what's listed here. And on the question of, you said this is an addition, this is ESSER 3.6 million. Is that in addition to the ARPA money, or is that part of the 43 million the town will get? I am so confused about that.
It's in addition to the ARPA money, but it's all ARPA money. It's just
Right.
ESSER is the school part of ARPA, and ARPA, called ARPA, is the town side. And it's the big difference is ESSER is managed by DESI and ARPA is not. That's managed through a different federal agency.
Okay. But it's not part of the 43 million. It's in addition to the 43. Thank you.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mariah, can I just say one more thing? I was going to try not to say it, but I don't think I can. I think it's two things are important to communicate. One is that yes, money is fungible. And so to some extent, it is a little, I wouldn't call it random, but I would call it arbitrary, what gets put on this list and what doesn't. And at the same time, what gets put on this list sends signals about what it is that, actually two things. It sends signals about what it is that we think ESSER money should be used for, unless we're going to just tell people it's arbitrary, which is a little strange. But I mean, we should be transparent about that, but that we hadn't been thoughtful at all about what was on this list is a little bit of an odd message. So hopefully we're not going to send that message that yes, it's arbitrary in theory, but we did actually think through what to use ESSER money for. So I think that's one. And I guess the other one is that it starts to send signals around what is potentially first up for discussion to not continue, since the money isn't going to continue, and anything else is going to look like a cut. It was going to feel like a cut. And so I guess I would just sort of re-up the idea of doing our best to think through what are one-time funds. And I really appreciate, Sam, that you pulled out that one line item. I think there probably are other one-time line items in our $120-some million budget. I just think that we have not gone through the disciplined exercise of thinking through the like grappling with the cliff. And it just feels to me like that's a pretty important thing to do, especially if we're going to have any sort of community engagement process around this or around the rest of the town's money, because I think the first question is going to be, well, what did you do with the money you already got? And why? And then why do you need more? So I think there's just some important like pieces that we have sort of skipped past because we need to kind of make budget decisions and move on. But I actually think that they're pretty important to go back and try to do, because otherwise I think it's going to cause problems for us later. So hopefully that made some sense, but I do want to re-up the idea of thinking through what it is that's here, why, and to whatever extent the cliff is sort of on its way, how we're starting to think about that. Because again, I think we're just going to get that as, we owe it to ourselves as fiduciaries, but also I think we're going to get it as a pretty quick question if we start to apply for other parts of the ARPA package. Okay, I'm done. So
no, that's perfect. But I want to say two things about that. One is we made it clear, and I remember Donna, we talked about this umpteen times last year about everything on ESSER 2, ESSER 3 has to be labeled. Just because it's in ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 doesn't mean it's being discontinued at the end of that funding. So I think that message needs to be re-upped to this point of what is included here and why. And I think people will fixate on the software, probably because of many reasons, but I think it would be valuable, Linus and Sam, from the community outreach and engagement perspective, if just like as a mirror to the ARP OpenGov story that the town has done, if we could have an OpenGov page, an OpenGov story about this funding, and then we could perhaps review some of this wording, because I think it is really important to send the right message, and we're happy to work on making sure that the right sort of consistent messaging and tone, that, as Susan says, it's not arbitrary. We had to pick things, but we're trying to pick things that match the goal of the program and so on and so forth. And then that can be a great tool for us to use to do some of this community outreach and input, which is, the hearing is tentatively scheduled for October 21st, which is a month from yesterday. So we need to get on that. Does that, Sam, are you on board with an OpenGov story?
Sure. I mean, it'll give me good training to put stories out there. So I'm glad Donna's on the meeting, because Donna will help me. At least I can type the narrative, but at least getting used to pushing that kind of information out through that portal.
Okay, great. Okay, 2 minutes behind schedule, but we'll soldier on. So let's turn over to the next item on the agenda, which
Sorry,
is,
sorry.
go
Before we
ahead.
move on, sorry.
That's okay.
So we're required to then report out what's being spent under ESSER as part of our community engagement responsibilities.
We're required to get stakeholder input into the plan.
Right, but and we're defining the plan as both actuals and projected.
Yes,
Okay.
in this case,
And-
right. Well, I'll
and
say
so-
projected, which is going to turn into actuals, right? So, yeah.
Right. And you're proposing that we have an OpenGov story to accompany this messaging so that the public can have a better understanding of how these priorities were determined under. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to go through that.
Okay.
Sorry, one last thing. So then why would a $3 million spend under literacy go under ESSER? I'm having trouble squaring that with the mandate of ESSER.
Because it was a chunk of base budget that could be broken off. But I think Sam said earlier that this is going to be revised at some point. That was what Sam was. Go ahead, Sam, comment on it.
I'm saying it's likely to be revised in some way. This was done, I mean, I'm looking at the date that this was printed. It was June 29th. And, you know, from June, we're almost 3 months past there, and priorities have changed. I mean, let's be clear, if we took this entirety of 3 million and put it back in the operating budget, it'd be another 3 million that would come out and go here. What that is, I don't know. You have to write some sort of programmatic justification, you know, of why you're spending. Again, it's fairly
I get that.
wide
I'm just
open.
going back to Susan's distinction of whether this was arbitrarily selected for inclusion under ESSER allocations, or whether there was a strategic priority to fund this through ESSER. So,
I can't answer
I'm
that
just
question.
okay.
I'm sorry, I can't.
And please excuse me taking so long on these ignorant questions. I don't know the answers to these things. Sorry, Maria, please go on.
I would say, though, I don't see that the literacy specialists are unaligned with ESSER money, just to be clear. I mean, ESSER is all about return to school and bringing back and like learning recovery and so forth. So it's having the literacy specialists in there is not shocking or unaligned. Anyway, let's keep going to fiscal year 23 budget discussion. So Sam, do you want to start the conversation, or do you want me to? How do you want to start this?
I can talk about our conversation that we had and then defer to you. I mean, and the conversation I had with Melissa Goff yesterday. We have a big unknown with respect to a collective bargaining agreements in general. And given that payroll is 85% of our budget plus, and most of that is in contracts, except for paras are not settled, that's a big unknown. And these are sometimes back to last year, this year, and then next year. That being, and not counting the cliff that we're trying to collectively mitigate. And so in talking with Melissa, the sense I got was that absent an infusion of new revenue, and that can come from a myriad of sources, it's unlikely there'll be enough money to catch us up for the amount of reliance that we've had this year that has to be weaned off next year and onto the operating budget, absent any reductions in program. So that I'll just put that out there. And the other, so the two options, as I understand it, and it is somewhat time sensitive, given the timeline that ties to the budget calendar that we're going to talk about, is around on or about the end of November. The powers that be, I assume BFAC, Select Board, have to decide whether there's a multi-year plan to be funded by a general override that would be balloted in May, or a one-year solution stopgap to be funded out of ARPA town side, specifically revenue retention or revenue replacement. Yeah. Or do nothing. And if the do nothing option, then it's likely there would have to be some sort of reduction, because as I understand it, there wouldn't be enough resources otherwise to bring to bear to make the department whole without, we wouldn't be able to balance without some material amount of reductions, all things being equal. And I think I'll stop there.
So was that clear to everyone? That essentially, right, it's what we sort of previewed in our statement to town meeting last spring. Either we increase revenues or we decrease expenses. Using the one-time funds was a deferral, right, of the to support the base budget. But and as Melissa's forecasting via Sam, the three options are the override, the revenue replacement, or nothing. And before we get into the details of the calendar and the budget priorities, I guess my question to the committee is how the committee wants to take this forward in terms of advocating to the full school committee, like our early thoughts on, those three choices, and also offer a moment to Linus. Linus, if you'd like to say anything about that before or after the committee. Do you want to go before or after?
I'll go after. Thank you.
Okay. David, I saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Just going to ask that of these three categories that you just mentioned, how viable is each one? Revenue replacement, for example, seems like it's probably quite limited in scope.
I was at meetings. I think Mariah might have been at the same meeting. The number that's been floated, my short answer is there's enough money. The capacity currently, as Melissa has calculated, and I hear that's the floor, is $6.1 million. Now that has to cover all the town, but I'm hopeful our number would fill $3 million of that 6 million is my goal of what our need would be for supplement. And I presumably there'd be enough left out of that 6.1 to cover the sound side and any undistributed expenses that there isn't enough revenue otherwise.
I would only flag that this past year, our ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 summed that we thought we were going to need to cover our base budget was just over 5 million. So 3 million versus 5 million. Granted, we were able to shift some of that, as you've heard in the earlier conversation today, but 3 million may not be enough to actually address the gap, especially when we go back to what Sam started with earlier with the sort of unknown. There's the existing cliff plus the unknown cliff relating to contracts that are not that are in negotiations. Other comments, questions from the committee? Stephen?
Is there any reason why we couldn't combine scenarios? Is it possible to consider a smaller override and some requests for revenue replacement and reducing our expenses?
A little bit of one, a little bit of two, a little bit of three.
Yeah, is that viable, or is that just adding complexity?
I think it's viable. Sam, Cliff, anyone? We can always reduce our expenses. I'm sure people will always let us do that.
So,
I mean, doing nothing is reducing expenses.
Yeah.
so I would expect that, you know, the select board and the town administrators, they're going to look at everything, and combining things, you know, it would certainly be a scenario that people would look at. I don't think it has to be or necessarily should be just one bucket.
In previous overrides, for example, the 2015 override, it was the override combined with new revenue sources like increased parking meter fees and other stuff. So there is a precedent there of that. Other comments, questions before we go to Linus?
I just want to make one clarification for Sam's benefit, and that is that BFAC doesn't exist anymore. So it's not as if BFAC is out there as part of this process, just so you know.
I think,
Thank
Sam,
you.
maybe you meant town school partnership, Sam.
That could be.
Yeah, when you were talking about who was going to decide.
I thought both entities existed still. You're saying BFAC does no longer exist?
BFAC was a special committee that was formed for a very specific purpose. David Perlman was on it. And once that study was completed and a report delivered to the select board, then BFAC itself disbanded.
Thank you for that clarification. All right, before we turn it over to Linus, where is the space for discussion of these options? Is that in this subcommittee? Is there a broader forum for it? Because I would love to hear informed opinions on what scenario seems most desirable and viable. Or
now's the time for informed discussion on the different options.
Do you
for
have
anyone.
any opinions, Mariah? Or Susan,
I do,
or?
but why don't Linus, do you want me to go first or second? Maybe second after you.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in here to say that I think as we continue to think about monies, expenditures, revenues, the whole package here, I'm contextualizing it in the standpoint of where I am sort of in my entry process. So as I've shared with the committee, I'm deeply immersed in that deep learning and understanding of the system. And that report of findings will come out in the January, February timeframe. And then at that point, in the spring of 22, we will, as a system, as a community, engage in a strategic planning process where we determine what our 3 to 5 year range goals are and work. And the idea there is to have everything that we do, every decision that we make, be in support or in the direction of the strategic plan. So that won't necessarily come online until probably until the fall or winter, possibly of 22. So there's still what I sometimes refer to as a gap in terms of an education plan directly informing a financial plan as one would normally expect it to be. So we have to know that we're continuing to exist sort of in that dimension for a little while longer. Then at that point, everything should align up where our education plan is set, and then our financial plan is informed by that educational plan.
So to me, that argues for the school committee, or at least I think the school committee advocating for a revenue replacement 1 year sort of runway to allow Linus and the senior leadership to do the work they need in really laying out this vision and this educational plan. I don't think it makes sense at this point, as I'm thinking about it, to ask for a 3-year override this spring in advance of being able to do this sort of formative work that's being described. And I think that it would put Linus at a disadvantage with the community to be able to articulate that need in advance of this work that you're talking about. So to me, it makes much more sense to pursue the revenue replacement, possibly, as you say, in combination, I'm not sure, we'll say at least combination with looking at what we can do in terms of our expenses if we need to do that, and to pursue that approach for the upcoming year. But I think that's what we're here to discuss. And I think it's going to need to go, of course, to full school committee too, to think about what we as a committee want to do, working with Linus to ensure we're all on the same page. Cliff, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. So I guess I have a question as to whether there is any sort of preliminary indication as to the gap or the cliff that is being referenced, to put some of this in context. And I also think just it's worth everyone understanding, or at least having in the back of their mind, a couple of things. In the 10 days from now, there's going to be 2 special town meetings that are going to have a budget impact, one of which will be the Driscoll ground source heat pumps, and the other will be the settlement in the Gerald Olson litigation. And to the extent that both those pass, let's assume that they do, the way that they are structured, the funding for them could have easily have an impact on available funds for both operations and or the capital improvement program. And how that filters through is something that you should be thinking in the back of your mind. You'll have more obviously answers about that within 10, 12 days, but don't lose sight of that potential impact.
Sam, I don't know if you've done any updated modeling of the budget, but I can share that the town's fiscal year 22, can you see the screen? The long range financial plan shows.
Mariah, is it possible to blow it up just a little bit?
How's that? Does that work better?
Perfect.
Okay. So you can see, I think these are still crude forecasts, but it gives you a sense of the school's budget increase from fiscal year 22 to fiscal year 23. Cliff, does that help in terms of just thinking about at least what they were thinking almost a year ago for next year's budget? You're on mute if you're talking.
The best place for me. I mean, yes, but as we all know, that the budget is balanced every year, so these numbers probably should be just updated for everyone.
Oh, I agree, but just as sort of a rough order of magnitude, in the absence of Sam having anything else yet to provide in terms of a projected gap forecast.
Okay, thank you.
Sam, if you have something more update to that, then feel free. I guess
my only thoughts were going to be, you're right, Mariah, in that there are 2 pieces, right? I can speak more to the budget was built this year, and you're right, Cliff, clearly 22 was balanced. And I think the number I saw there with the 11 million deficit in 22 had 127 million going to the schools, and that number was south of 120. So 7 million of that 11 didn't get allocated because the money presumably wasn't there to allocate. Now, of ESSER 2 and 3, which again, when I came in here, the budget for 22 assumed every penny was going to be utilized in 22 for operating expenses. Those 2 numbers together add up to $5.3 million. So all things being equal, that would be the shortfall that we would first have to backfill before you even take new money to move the system forward, assuming all things being equal. When I throw out 3 million, just as a hypothetical, let's assume, and I told you there are 2 items here, you see it on my memo, that have been undesignated, that if you add together, it's almost $738,000, 738,000 to be exact. I like round numbers. Let's say we didn't spend $1 million in ESSER 3 and it could carry next year. Well, then we don't have a $5.3 million problem. We have a $3.3 million problem because $1 million wasn't needed in the budget. It was $1 million less. And then we have $1 million in the next year to pay for the money that we relied on. So we don't have to raise and appropriate that. We can pay, and again, that's presumptuous to say it's going to turn out that way, but that's the mechanics behind it. But that being said, there's an assumption of what settlements would be for last year for contracts that weren't settled. There's an assumption in this year's budget for what we think, or what I inherited, people thought could be enough to settle. And next year, I'm going to be charged with coming with a number that I think is, with knowing what was set aside for 21, knowing what's set aside for 22, what I think needs to be set aside for 23, that we have a reasonable chance of getting a number that matches. And then to Mariah's point, depending on what that number adds up to, is going to tell you first, how much do we need to fill the gap? And then how much additional money do we need to keep what we have and move it forward? And that I don't know yet, but that's that I need to know that in the next couple of months is when that should begin to crystallize. I hope that makes sense to you. But
Cliff?
I'm sorry, just again for clarification, Sam, you started your comments with saying that page that Mariah had up had 127 odd million, but there was only 120 million. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mariah, but what's in the budget book is the total of all expenses that, for the schools, not just what's allocated under the town school partnership. So that 127,
Correct.
that 127 would have included the ESSER money, the circuit breaker money, and things of that nature. But
I think that's Sam's point, is that there's a $5 million gap there filled by ESSER, because the town share was 120-ish, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I took his comment to say it shows 127, but you only got 120. That 127 was actually the entire budget with components which included 120.
correct. The 2.3 million from circuit breaker, that's recurring, but the other 5.3 in ESSER is not.
Agreed.
Okay. Any other comments that we want to make on this? Is going to be a recurring theme, obviously. And as Sam alluded to earlier, I think there's going to need to be some decisions made this fall, both in terms of these projections and what this all looks like. So we're going to hear plenty about this with more information, certainly coming up. But I thought it was important to preview it now so that we can start to have these sort of discussions about where we want to go as a group. I'm going to flip over to the calendar, if that's okay with people. This is a quick review. This is the first reading of the calendar. Let me pull up the document, and I'll share this with everyone afterwards. Sam and I are still refining it in terms of making sure it interweaves. It should mostly be connected to the town processes because it's based off of prior year documents, but Sam's working on this still with people. So this is, I need to move some of the Zoom stuff out of the way. This is make this document bigger. Thanks. Yeah, sorry about that. Can you see that? So this is the budget development calendar, and it's by month, and then it's got what the staff are doing, what the finance subcommittee is doing, and what the school committee is doing, and then other, to try and help people see the things that are happening in their sort of relevant areas of their relevant scope. So I actually put in some notes here for today's meeting just to make sure, because to my mind, I'm tracking in this version of it right now, all the things that we want to talk about during the year. But you can see that there's, for example, finances, the staff are working on, for example, the first draft of these documents. We're going to discuss them at the meeting. They will go to school committee tomorrow to look at this calendar along with the guidelines that we're going to start talking about and so on. You'll see that in October, we have the second drafts of these, the calendar and the guidelines. Also, we'll get the Q1 report, which hopefully will include revolving funds. Our November meeting, an update on the budget. It gets a little bit less detailed as we go because it's further out. And you can see some of these things. So I'm going to share this with people by, it should be, we'll share it in a folder so you can see this as well. But it's a quick sort of breakdown. And then you can see that we have like our required, the public hearing, the budget recommendation narrative, and so on and so forth. Sam, do you want to talk at all, or Linus, about your plan for the budget document this year really quickly while we're going through this, since the budget document is referenced in here?
I guess I feel, don't take it the wrong way, I feel obligated to talk about it. I know it's a work in progress. Last year, for a host of reasons, my understanding is, when I looked at what the town put out in their comprehensive document, there was a section for which the school department didn't have anything submitted. That clearly needs to change. It's what goes in it. And I know Linus has ideas about school profiles and where to, and I've been working with OpenGov to try to see how we can have OpenGov, not work for us rather than us work for OpenGov, with respect to utilizing systems we have and then pushing out information that we don't have to do shadow systems as much, and really just then spend the time writing narrative, knowing that the numbers are good. And so I've been having ongoing meetings with OpenGov, but in the position that helped put this book together, I'm in the process of filling. And so hopefully between all those moving parts, I want to be able to deliver a book. I guess the big question I have, and I'm deferring to Linus and others, is do we want to take a fresh opportunity to put something new together? Because the book that I saw before was like near 300 pages, and and then does OpenGov replace that book? And at that point, they're not meant. Do we not publish the 300-page book and then just publish something smaller and let open? I guess that's sort of where my head's at right now, as I'm still getting my arms around the process that is Brookline and the budget.
I know Susan has strong feelings about the budget book. Susan, do you want to share some of your, I'm going to let you just vent right now. A little catharsis, some therapy about the budget book.
So look, at the end of the day, I think people are still going back to their paper version that we gave to them, I don't know how long ago, 3 years ago now, and trying to compare to it, because there really isn't anything that people can hang on to called a budget book. And so I think that we definitely have heard it from town meeting members, that they like something mailed to them that they can look at. So maybe that'll be different in 5 years, but I don't feel like it's different right now. And I don't have anything I can email to them. Sending people to the website doesn't really scratch the itch. And it's hard to kind of like go back and forth with the website unless you're literally going to download everything and put it into a PDF document, in which case there's sort of an obvious question of like, why didn't we do that at one point in time? Mindful that it changes every day. So it's only as good as, until the ink dries. So that's, that's understood. But I do think that like picking a time of like, calling it and having a set of numbers that we can talk about is pretty helpful, so that we're not, every time people see a set of numbers on a PowerPoint, they're not different. And it's just super confusing to try to explain to people. So that's my advocacy for having a document.
So I think part of what, so in support of that, because I heard that message loud and clear when Sam came on board, I said we will provide a budget book this year to folks. But what we're going to do is take some time to innovate, and we're going to go through series of those innovations. So I think one of the things that Mariah was referencing when looking through the calendar is some things that we've been talking about with school leaders as well as the senior team, having what we're calling essentially school profile sheets. So what is it about each school that makes each school community stand out? That's setting us up for a larger marketing sort of campaign of what's special and what's unique about my school. So that will have multi-use there. We're also looking at this idea of sort of what is the staffing profile? What have been the number of FTEs over the years, and what does that look like, and how does that change from year to year? So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. What is it from the school improvement plan process? So once all of that gets aligned, that may be something that those education, sort of an executive summary of the school plans goes into this book as well, because again, the education plan should be driving the financial plan. And so this is again an opportunity to start in the direction of right-sizing the ship in that direction. So those are some of the innovations that we're looking to bring to this, and we won't spill all the milk right now. We want to save some of that for the special time when this actually goes live. But those are some of the things that we're thinking about, including that will be important for this type of communication.
I was just, when I mentioned it, I was thinking you could say there's going to be a book, because I wanted to give Susan a boon of.
And look, you didn't prime me with that, and I said it, right?
No, you did way better. But I'm excited by it. Even if, and recognizing that of all the things you're talking about, not everything's going to happen in year one, but that there at least will be a book this year is, I think, exciting for people. And go ahead, Stephen.
Mariah, a question about the calendar. So the public presentation was a week before the vote. In the past, that's just caused a lot of frustration, I think, in the community, because it feels pro forma, and it feels like any community input is not going to be included. Would it be possible to hold at least one other community engagement session where input is invited? And is it possible also, if we do something like that?
Let me
bring up your calendar.
I am, because I think there's two things. One is that, are you saying that the hearing is the week beforehand, the presentation is 2 weeks before that? Are you saying that you want more time between the hearing and the vote?
Yes.
Okay.
So that
there could be
opportunity for
theoretical
input.
response or reaction to what's heard at the hearing is the idea.
Yeah, and in fact, is it at all possible to have a hearing prior to the presentation wherein something less detailed than a superintendent's presentation is presented, so that the public has an opportunity to start to consider where or how they want to advocate?
Linus, there's this draft budget and discuss superintendent budget request recommendation. Do you want to consider doing in advisory, we talk about having the school preview budget. Do you want to talk about doing maybe like a December preview? Or what's your thinking, or you, Sam, on how to react to giving people more of a heads up?
Well, I know certainly from the internal standpoint, we'll need to do this. Yeah, certainly the internal aspects of it, because again, in order to have all of those pieces come out when we need them for February, the work will have to begin well ahead of that. So that makes sense to start it there.
Okay, I'll put that in there and we can iterate on that for the next version of this.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Stephen. Anything else on the calendar, what we've already talked about before we go ahead to the guidelines and priorities? Okay. For guidelines and priorities, we didn't actually propose any new ones. I'm just going to pull up last year's document. And I'll put the link in the chat too. Before or we don't have a chat. Never mind. I won't put the link in the chat. Let's see. So if you recall from last year, these were written, but were not ever voted. And here are the guidelines. And I guess the question is, what's missing? What should be removed as a first pass? And again, this is just the document from last year. And I can't see people or your hands, so go ahead and just speak up if you want to say things.
I'm just wondering if we're sure that the fourth bullet point from the
This one?
Right. Can we really assume a return to normal school programming? I understand the Remote Learning Academy obviously is not continuing, but we have had discussions about providing enhanced educational opportunities for students who are absent due to COVID-19 related reasons. And we certainly are taking all kinds of precautions on the operational side. So it's not a normal school year in that sense already. So I think we might want to consider.
So this was a faulty or a flawed guideline that we came up with last year, and you're saying let's refine it to more accurately reflect what's going on?
I think so, yes.
I guess my only thoughts generally is I would try to narrow the bullets down. There's just a lot of them. And then that's in the guidelines. The other thing to be mindful of, and although if you asked me a year ago how I thought the pandemic was tracking, I didn't think we'd be where we are now. But what a lot of what's going to drive the bullets in a lot of cases is we're going to have to make an assumption of where we think the pandemic will be as of beginning July 1st of next year. And that'll drive some of the guidelines, presumably. I don't know how long this was done in January. Maybe by January but then again, if we're developing in a perfect world, the only other comment I would have is presumably by mid-November, this should be out. If we're going to do it, because then we begin to build a budget starting at that time, and need to have the guidelines if you want a budget that's built that takes these into account.
The other thing, I'm gonna channel Susan from last year, which was that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, and there's a lot of stuff listed here. And so given the financial situation we find ourselves in, do we want to come up with reverse priorities or something that helps us distinguish where we are willing to, if needed, cut?
Mariah, I had a similar thought, but two comments. One is that I think we can bucket these bullets because some of them I think describe the technical process by which the budget is developed, like that it should include on it, like the first
Like
two
this
bullets.
kind of thing,
Yeah.
and yeah, those.
And I think that'll
yeah.
also simplify it for people considering it. There actually are adhere to class size guidelines that these all belong in very basic criteria for budget development. They could hardly be considered a budget priority. I wonder if we could have one bullet, one bucket that captures all that, and then another that lists our priorities. Or if we want to even, forgive this, we have a third section which just defines the values by which the budget is being developed. Like, because my thought, based on from linked to what you just said, was that we need to have something in here that says that we need to be evaluating the I don't want to say cost efficiency or return on investment, but some we have an eye towards eliminating low value investments because of the looming cliff. Like that does need to be captured in this list, I would think.
Linus, do you think that this year the Office of Teaching and Learning or the Office of Student Services will have, or other offices, but I think of those two as being primary sort of evaluators or having done assessments that what might lead to that sort of conclusion about programming?
I don't know that this year will be the sole year to bucket it. I think we're starting to target and tee things up. So I think, seeing this, reading this and listening to the conversation that's happening here, I think I'm going to just print it out and sort of digest it and run it through sort of my thinking about some of the drivers. So it's looking at some of the, as Stephen said, some of the technical aspects of it, but then what are the aspirational or the desired outcomes that we're actually looking for? And then what are sort of our commitments? So there's a number of ways that we can frame this, but the essence of what actually went into building the budget, I think is what we're trying to get at here. And so some of these, I can understand the time and place of this, considering what the district was experiencing. But I think as we're sort of moving on to the next goalpost, what are some of the broader brushstrokes that we need to take here, again, to set us up for where we're going to go the next year. That's the way I'm thinking. That's sort of the gap year. This is the intermittent step to get us to the bigger field that we want to play on.
Robin, can you give Helen an FYI that we're going to go to CIP in a couple minutes? Hopefully you heard me. On that point, Linus, I just want to flag that while we're discussing it, this is actually from Jim. So really, this is a document from you, and this conversation is really just meant to inform you about what we want to see in your priorities. The one thing that
Absolutely.
I would mention. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So yeah, so exactly what you're saying of you should make it yours. And I do think, though, I agree with Stephen, and sort of like it's helpful to bucket the things that we would see in there every year just to sort of like good practice, and then the things that are sort of special to the current circumstances. And in here, they're somewhat blurred together. They sort of like, there's a new strategic planning process, but then we have, anyways, they're all sort of scattered. The one thing that here that I think about is this examine summer learning opportunities for students. Last year, the language was examine summer learning opportunities. We did it. And I guess my question is, do we try to, maybe we've gone past examine, but is this something, to our earlier conversation about universal summer program, and was it a one-time thing or a recurring thing? And Stephen's point about ROI, is that something that we think is worth trying to institutionalize? And if so, how does that look in sort of your development of your budget? To me, it's a big novelty that we talked about, as well as the two big novelties were the universal summer program and the school adjustment counselors. And so how those get institutionalized, assuming they will be, would be valuable to hear from you about. Any other thoughts on things that we want to share with Linus and Sam as this goes forward for the FY23 guidelines?
I'm just wondering, this is Suzanne, Mariah, just on the projected enrollment. I'm not sure what that should look like for next year, since we were down still quite a bit this year. So whatever those thoughts might be helpful.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about that plenty as well, Linus, over the year. But earlier on, given it's your budget, it has a budget impact. What you and Aaron and Sam are going to decide to do on that, and Megan are going to decide to do on that front. But yeah, I think it would be helpful, Suzanne, because that's such an enrollment is obviously the hugest driver of what's going on. So explaining your sort of planning for that would be great. Okay, I'm going to park this one. We got 15 minutes left. And the last item on the agenda is CIP. And Sam is going to be walking us through what was submitted. Oh, good. Helen is just arriving, just on time. Sam's going to be walking us through what was submitted for CIP.
I'm certainly going to try. Hold on one second. So I spoke again. I spoke with Matt Gillis. I spoke with Melissa Goff. The problem, what I'm trying to get my arms around. So I will tell you what I've seen, but I will tell you what I haven't been able to see, if that makes any sense. So Matt had given Linus and I an email that talked about the 23 to 28, well, that's a 6-year, it's a 6-year in Brookline budget capital improvement plan. And in that plan, it has a subset, I believe, of everything school. And so what I mean by that is Matt has put in 250 for F23, because even though it's a 6-year capital plan, 23 to 28, the year, and this isn't unique to Brookline, the year that really is focused is the first year, because that's where the money comes, and appropriated. And so F23 is year 1. And the 2 things that Matt Gillis put in, because he felt that's all that was his the area he could put in. It was the $250,000 to update the master plan, and $670,000 for the high school for 2 items that aren't broken out separately. One is to upgrade the public announcement system, and the other is to upgrade and replace what we know as smart boards in a host of classrooms. And the 2 together cost $670,000 is what's place carded. Then Melissa Goff put in another 5 items, and I'll run through them. $1,827,048 for classroom capacity, i.e. the leases, Clark Road and the Maimonides largely driving that. HVAC equipment, $100,000, I think is just a placeholder for need. $250,000 for school. It says school rehab upgrade. That might be for, I guess, for projects, maybe mini CIP projects. $85,000 for ADA improvements district wide, and $160,000. Sorry, I'm squinting, but on my other screen, for furniture upgrades. I imagine as needed, where classrooms need, furniture doesn't seem to, it's out past its useful life, enrollment changes, what have you. So you add, there's all these. But what isn't in here, it's more notable what isn't here. So what isn't here are the geothermal tubes at Driscoll, 5 million. What isn't here is Baldwin, which numbers have been batted around about 9 million. What isn't here, there's a list that Helen put together, you know, that I have in front of me, I'm pretty sure.
The one that was voted at Capitol to be submitted.
Right, and I guess the word I got is that's done through a different department, which I don't have access to that in OpenGov to even see what, if anything, was
She's talking-
submitted.
Huh? I don't get, Cliff, can you put some clarity on that?
Well, I don't know about Baldwin. I think the entire Driscoll discussion, you know,
Driscoll, forget about Driscoll and the
Okay.
well, forget about that. Let's not go there. Because that
Okay.
wasn't even on our list,
But they're
actually.
playgrounds, there are other big ticket items
Yeah.
that aren't anywhere
But we
that I.
put on
so
our
so
list-
so the question is whether or not the items you're talking about would be considered actual capital improvement items versus repair and maintenance items. And to the extent that they are capital items, things like playgrounds, might that come through the Parks and Rec Department, and maybe there's somewhere in the CIP under that classification. I'm just not sure.
So what
Oh.
happened, what happens with the playgrounds, so we can take that in specific. The Parks and Recs playgrounds that are adjacent to schools are taken care of by Parks and Recs. We had a whole presentation from Aaron telling us that there are 3 schools that need their playgrounds redone, that being the Lincoln School, the new Lincoln School, the Baker, and the Heath. Those were the 3 playgrounds that are our property playgrounds that need to be redone. She put a price tag on them of $3 million apiece. I think that's high, but that's what she put on. Actually, she put 3.2 million for Baker. I would suggest that that may be something that we wouldn't do Baker right now, since that's probably the next school that will need renovation when we get to it. So I guess what I'm not clear about, there's a lot of the things, the ADA, the school furniture, what was the third one you said?
HVAC.
HVAC was 100,000 and
Yeah,
then mini
those are
CIP
Charlie's
is
items that
250.
he has. Those are Charlie's items that he has in the CIP every year. Last year, they didn't make it in, I think, because there was no money in the
Correct.
CIP. But those are regular items and our leases. Those are the items that are in there. But I think what we were talking about is with Baldwin, if we can renovate it for the BEEP program, we can get out of the lease in Putterham at 380,000 a year. Yes, it's an investment of money, but it's also a possibility that, you know, then we don't need to it will be less reliant on leases, along with, as we build Driscoll, the 3 beeps, and we build Pierce. And if I'm saying too much, you can stop me, Mariah, at any time. And when we build the 3 beeps in Pierce, we will then have covered the 5 classrooms that we have at Ove Shalom and get out of that lease. Our lease at Putterham goes for another year. I have the listing of when they end.
Well, I think, Helen, from my perspective, the question is, this is a sort of a finance capital crossover, right? And
Right.
we need to have we as a school committee need to have a full list of what our capital requests have been and sort of keep it up to date year to year.
Right.
And so that we know, because right now and then also I think that we want all these, we want to be able to have that, and we want to make sure it actually got submitted. It's right now, Sam can't even tell if the Baldwin and other big things that were discussed, that were voted and discussed in capital were actually submitted. So I think this is a twofer. One is going back to do the digging that Sam's going to do to make sure, and then Shirley, it was an omission, an accidental omission, and they will allow it to still be submitted anyways. But then for our own purposes as a school committee, we do need to have this running list and have it be a document that we can refer to, just like, and I think that'll be the basis for a lot of our capital, not a lot, but certainly an important piece of information for our capital strategic plan that we're hoping to do too. But it also ties to the finances,
also
right?
For the ARP monies that might be available that are beyond the flexible monies. That, would those, the 30,000 or 30 million, excuse me, could any of that be applied to any of these projects? So it's like we need to, we have to they need to accept that these are our requests. They may not fulfill them, but these are our requests.
And when something has been on the list, I mean, I think this is part of just looking at a peer community. What Newton does is they have a running list, and then that way it's been documented, it's there.
Mhm.
And when funds do become available, that need is there, and it's been documented, and they can slot something in.
And one important thing I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one important thing to remember, Sam, that you don't know, Baldwin has been on the CIP for years, for windows, for roof repairs, for I think it was even a boiler replacement at one time. So there were monies at one time that were directed towards Baldwin that then got reassigned. And that's what happens with the CIP. You put it in for 1 year. If it doesn't happen or something happens that, you got changed because Baldwin, we were thinking about doing a new building there. So it didn't make sense to invest the money, but those were in the CIP. Once they get thrown out of the CIP, I don't know what happens to them. Maybe you do, Cliff.
So I'm not as familiar with that process. Carla is obviously the best person to talk to about that. So I don't want to offer to venture a guess because I'll probably be wrong. So
Fine.
So on the agenda, we had a review and possible sort of endorsement vote. Obviously, I don't think we're there, that we're behind where we hoped for on that. But I think it's helpful for us to have at least this conversation and have people understand where this is at and sort of what the goal is in terms of a long-term sort of document tracking where we're at.
And, to use the CIP monies to accomplish the needs that we have. That,
Yep.
Yes, we shouldn't have all of it. And obviously we're using quite a bit right now for a new school. So it's hard to ask for money. There's no doubt about that. But on the other hand, we also need to think, in the future, what we can access.
Yeah.
Any other, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, sort of at the risk of being proposing something I will probably get voted down on. I think that this is one of those situations where we kind of have to figure out what we need to decide immediately and why, and which pieces really should be part of the longer term plan, like kind of capital and facilities plan. I mean, sort of speaking as one person, I would like to have a serious conversation about whether we should sell Baldwin and do something else with those funds. Not that Baldwin isn't beautiful, but what we need is, if we need beep space and we had the financial equivalent of whatever we could sell Baldwin for, is that how we would we buy it today? And I think the answer is probably no. And so it's hard for me to imagine investing millions of dollars in Baldwin when I personally am not convinced we should own it. And I think there are other things that we need to think about, like Newberry, there are so many moving parts in this that it's hard to sort of pick off giant investment in Baldwin right now. So, and I only pick on Baldwin to say that, the conversation at the time of the ninth school was, what we need is a place to build a ninth school. What we don't need is an expensive piece of property where we can't build a ninth school. I mean, the conversation's moved since then, but I would just not want to assume that everything is fixed. And especially if we're going to try to go through a process with a consultant or anyone else to try to rationalize our capital needs. So I'll just put that out there, and
I
I
would
expect-
respectfully.
I want to make
disagree
sure,
with
hang
you.
on, Helen, I want to make sure we don't devolve into capital, like as this isn't capital too.
I thought we were
So-
getting asked to vote on this though.
Well, from the financial perspective of just looking at it like review, and this is how much we've requested in dollars and so forth. We don't have that
Okay.
outlined because we didn't get it.
Okay.
But really it was meant to just in that lens. And I completely agree with you. There's a much larger conversation, but I don't want to have it at the end of our meeting now that it's over at 7 o'clock at night.
That's
So-
fine, but are we going to have it before we vote? And if not, I mean, again, I'm happy to just vote no and let it go. But if we're not going to have it before we vote, the priority conversation, I'm not quite sure what the plan is, I guess.
Okay, so I'll say really quickly that you've been at the capital meetings when we've had that same conversation, right? Yeah, so we do need to have it, I agree.
Okay.
Yep. Anything else on this before we wrap it up for tonight? So, Sam, in terms
Yes,
of,
I have one question. So
Yeah.
when you spoke to Melissa, did she say there was any other monies in the CIP?
She didn't say one way or the other, no.
And did she ask for any other things that we might want to have done?
No, she didn't ask, no.
Okay.
Sam, in terms of a takeaway from this, do you think that you can, over the next, whatever, obviously not in time for school committee tomorrow, but maybe for the next meeting, we can have some sort of a CIP listing, at least of what's coming up for what we did request for FY23, a consolidated
Well,
list?
Over and above this, yeah, I mean, I put in a call earlier, I know Melissa's is very busy, but I didn't hear back from her when I called this morning asking for what other pieces are somewhere else that I could know about so we could have a comprehensive discussion. Hopefully I'll hear back from her. If I do tomorrow, I'll let you know.
Okay, sounds good. Because yeah, I think this is something we don't want to lose track of. Okay. Any last comments before we wrap up for tonight? Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Talk to you later. Bye.
Right.